Welcome to the Digital Identity Digest, the audio companion to the blog at Spherical Cow Consulting. I'm Heather Flanagan, and every week I break down interesting topics in the field of digital identity, from credentials and standards to browser weirdness and policy twists. If you work with digital identity but don't have time to follow every specification or hype cycle, you're in the right place. Let's get into it. Welcome back. If you caught the last episode, you'll remember that we talked about how the real innovation isn't choosing between centralized or decentralized identity systems. It's about the ability to shift between the two. And if you didn't hear that episode, no worries. Here's the short version. When I talk about centralization, I'm not talking just about the infrastructure. I'm talking about the controls. A centralized identity system relies on one authority, like one identity provider, one source of truth, one way to enforce access, and everything flows through a single control point. In decentralized models, that control is distributed. You might issue credentials that can then be independently verified and used. You might support federation or allow for local policy decisions, and all of that's not chaos. It's just coordination across more than one authority. Now, most enterprise systems fall somewhere in the middle, and it's not a question of which one is better. It's how much flexibility have you built into your dependencies and whether you're ready to shift between a centralized and a decentralized model when needed. And to just get this out of the way, if your brain jumps straight to blockchain when I say decentralized identity, you can just let that go. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're doing today is building into the next part of the story, because flexibility to shift between these two things isn't free. And in an enterprise identity system especially, that cost of decentralization can sneak up on you until one day it's like the only thing you can do. Okay, centralization, it absolutely works right up until the point that it doesn't. Most enterprise systems are mostly centralized by design because that's what scales, it's what we know, it's often seen as easier to manage, cheaper to deploy, and frankly, it's just more familiar. You pick a cloud provider, you configure your identity flows, you build the tools that make your day-to-day life easier for your teams. It's all totally reasonable. But centralization does come with trade-offs, and they don't always show up in your architecture diagram. They show up when your vendor changes its policies, or when a regulator demands regional data isolation, or when the company that owns your login page gets acquired and suddenly nothing is where it used to be. And that's when the invoice for centralization shows up. If you've prepared for that invoice, that's great. But if that kind of thing has come as a surprise to you and your organization, and it's a surprise you wish you could have avoided, well, then keep listening. Let's talk about those trade-offs and where they show up. Most organizations don't decide, yes, we are going to centralize all the things, and they decide to do that all in one time. It kind of just happens possibly gradually through, they've decided on tools to make things easier, vendors that consolidate functionality, and policies that just favor simplicity, as if people were simple. Most of the time, those decisions are totally reasonable. You pick AWS or Microsoft Azure because they offer global infrastructure and built-in security. Win. You standardize on a single identity provider because it simplifies access control and audit logging. Oh, simple. We like simple. You rely on a content delivery network, a DNS service, a messaging platform, not because you say, yes, I want to be locked into this one vendor, but because it just works and presumably provides you with some of the things that you would want in terms of redundancy and so on. And so, yay, go team. And those perfectly normal decisions can quietly create dependencies that are really hard to unwind. Now, we accept centralization because it feels efficient, but it also means you're betting on your vendors to never change, on your regulators to stay predictable, and on your systems to remain static. So the real question isn't, did we centralize too much? It's, do we know which parts of our systems are built around a trust that hasn't been stress tested yet? And that's where decentralization, or even just having a plan for decentralization, starts to pay off. So let's say you want to decentralize, or even just build in enough flexibility to avoid getting stuck. What does that actually cost? Because decentralization isn't just like a design pattern. It isn't something that you can do with a configuration flag. It shows up in how you hire your teams, how you build your systems, how you buy your SaaS applications and how you plan for things. Let's talk about 3 kinds of cost. First, the financial cost. I mean, redundancy by definition means you're paying for more than one way to do something. Maybe it's running services in 2 cloud regions. Maybe it's contracting with 2 vendors for the same function, knowing one will be primary and the other might never be used until the day you absolutely need them. All of that can be kind of hard to justify in a spreadsheet because you might end up looking inefficient. But what you're really doing is trading a little short-term inefficiency for some long-term adaptability, right? Okay, now there's operational cost. Decentralized systems require discipline to use. It's not just, the fact that you have more services, it's that you have to coordinate between those services. You need to have more observability of what's going on and more standardized policy enforcement, even when different systems own different parts of the workflow. That's not just a technical tax, it's like a complete shift in your culture because it means you actually have to write things down where people can find them. It means assuming failures will happen and designing the recovery plan before they do. But wait, there's more. There's also the strategic cost, and this one's actually the hardest to measure because decentralization forces your organizations to ask, do we want flexibility or do we want feature velocity? Do we want things to just go faster because we need to keep up with the market? Are we optimizing for today's comfort because this is easy or tomorrow's resilience because it might break? Another question, are we willing to make architectural choices that might look less efficient on paper but give us the options when it counts? And if all of that sounds like, tomorrow's problems, today's budget, if all that sounds difficult, well, you're right, it is. But chances are you've probably run into some version of this, even if you didn't call it, a balance between centralization and decentralization. Like when a vendor you rely on changes their roadmap and now you need to rebuild part of your flow. Or when a compliance audit forces you to isolate networks and your IAM systems can't segment that cleanly. Or when someone says, can we support external credentials for this because we have these contractors coming in? And you realize, well, no, not without a rewrite of a whole bunch of things. If you've ever had to duct tape yourself out of a dependency, then you've kind of already felt this cost of not being flexible between centralization and decentralization. And that's my point. This isn't about building redundant systems for the fun of it. It's about investing in flexibility before you need it. And if the cost of doing that right now feels a little too high, then just ask, well, what's it going to cost to do it later when you're under pressure? So let's come back to this idea of optionality, because that's really where decentralization pays off. It's not about building the parallel universe. It's about designing systems with room to move. And you can think of it, like a backup login method that doesn't rely on a single provider, or the ability to issue credentials even when your main service is down, or the flexibility to shift data storage between jurisdictions without breaking your compliance posture. If you've built in flexibility, that means you're not just going to react when something breaks. You can actually adapt and do this in some interesting and innovative ways, which is cool. But you got to recognize it doesn't come for free. This kind of optionality costs more planning up front. It costs more conversations with legal and compliance. It costs more thoughtful procurement and vendor selection. And sometimes, yes, it means building things twice or building the glue that holds them together. But it gives you that control before you need it. It's that difference between our vendor is down, we're stuck, and our vendor is down, we're shifting traffic, enforcing backup policies, and notifying effective users. It's not over-engineering, it's building systems that don't panic when the default plan fails, because the default plan will fail. Now, will your system collapse with it? Great question. Now, I'm gonna turn this into just an example that's like really, really personal, right? Instead of talking about the big corporate systems, let's talk about you. Because this might be something you have run into, especially if you've ever worked in, a high security enterprise. Imagine you're on a company-managed device, a lockdown browser, no local installs, VPN required for everything, and for most of your job, yes, it works, it's secure, it's predictable, totally reasonable, until that moment where you need to join a Google Meet with an external standards body, and yet Google has been blocked. Or you need to access a shared document on a non-whitelisted domain, well, that's been blocked too. Suddenly, your secure device becomes a wall, and it's not because the technology failed, but it's because the policies are very, very rigid. Now imagine if instead of having to fight with IT or abandoning the meeting, you could submit for an exception, one that was pre-modeled, well-governed, and aligned with business risk, something that didn't require committees of meetings and personal exceptions and things like that. That is what optionality would look like. Not chaos, not unmanaged bypasses, but a structured way to flex when the context changes. And this same kind of thing can apply to your identity architecture. If your entire system depends on one centralized identity provider, one login flow method, one trust model, then anytime you need to step out of that, even for good reason, you got a problem. Decentralization isn't about removing control, it's about creating trusted, intentional ways to shift it around when it has to happen. So the final takeaway, buy the control you need before you need it. You don't need to decentralize everything. You probably can't. And honestly, you probably shouldn't. But you do need to know where your dependencies live, where you've centralized by design, and where you've centralized by default, two separate things. Because when something goes sideways, whether it's a vendor acquisition, a regulatory shift, or a trust breakdown, you're going to want to have options. And the options are something you have to build in ahead of time. So ask yourself, where are we so centralized that a single point of failure becomes an existential risk? And what would it take to make that risk optional instead of inevitable? Even a small investment in flexibility buys you a little more breathing room, and breathing room is what makes resilience possible, not just technically, but operationally and strategically. And in our next episode, we're going to explore why so many systems default to centralization in the first place and whether our definition of success might be reinforcing fragility without us even realizing it. You can find the full blog post for this episode, The Cost of Decentralization, What Companies Need to Weigh Before They Commit, at sphericalcowconsulting.com. And thank you so much for listening. And remember, buy that control before you need it. And that's it for this week's episode of the Digital Identity Digest. If it helps make things a little clearer, or at least a little more interesting, share it with a friend or colleague and connect with me on LinkedIn at HL Flanagan. And if you enjoyed the show, do be sure to subscribe and leave me a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also find the written full post at sphericalcowconsulting.com. Now stay curious, stay engaged, and let's get these conversations going.